Okay, let's talk about a story that's circulating right now that is, well, it's extremely serious, and honestly, it's incredibly easy to get wrong. It involves these newly released documents tied to Jeffrey Epstein, viral statements from politicians, and some really explosive allegations being used in a big political fight. So our goal here is to cut through all that noise and carefully separate what's being claimed, what's actually in the documents, and what's been legally proven. Because blurring those lines, it really helps no one.
So what kicked off this whole recent news cycle? It was this moment. A sitting member of Congress, Ted Lieu, made a statement that just immediately went viral. It's a really powerful claim, and he says it's based on information from these recently released documents.
And that, right there, brings us to the central question we have to ask. To understand the real weight of that statement, we've got to go directly to the source. What are these documents, and what do they actually say?
First things first, let's get a clear baseline on what we're even talking about. You hear the term Epstein files, and it sounds like one single official government report. But the reality is way more complex than that.
Yeah, these files are not one unified story. They're a massive collection of legal paperwork from a bunch of different civil lawsuits, things like depositions, motions, and exhibits. You should think of it less like a finished book and more like a raw, unfiltered archive of legal arguments.
And because of that, the contents are, well, a chaotic mix. You have serious allegations sitting right next to statements that were never verified, references to people who weren't even accused of anything, and even lawsuits that were later dropped entirely. This mix is exactly why context is so critical here.
This right here, this is the single most important rule to remember when you're looking at any of this material. Just because a name appears in these documents does not mean that person is guilty of or even formally accused of any wrongdoing. This is not a list of people who've been indicted. It's just not.
Okay, so with that foundation set, we can now trace that specific allegation that Congressman Lieu mentioned back to its source. And it turns out it comes from a civil lawsuit filed several years ago.
So let's just walk through the life cycle of this specific claim. It started as a civil suit, filed by a woman who used the pseudonym Katie Johnson. The lawsuit accused both Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump of sexual assault. But here are the key facts you have to know. The plaintiff herself later withdrew the lawsuit, and no criminal charges ever came out of this specific case.
So here's the bottom line on that specific case. Because the suit was withdrawn, it never went to trial. And this is a critical point. When a civil suit gets dropped, the claims inside it are never tested in court. As a result, no legal findings of guilt were ever made. In fact, some parts of the claims were later disputed or even recanted. The allegation exists in the paper trail, for sure, but it remains unresolved and, legally speaking, unproven.
All right, let's zoom out. The confusion around all these documents goes way beyond just this one lawsuit. It's been amplified by two huge factors: how the government released the documents in the first place and the political environment we're all living in right now. And on this point, there's actually rare agreement from both sides of the aisle. The Department of Justice really mishandled parts of this release. They had improper redactions that led to the temporary and frankly horrifying exposure of victims' private information. This caused a swift backlash from survivor advocacy groups, and some documents even had to be pulled back after they were posted. It was a failure that damaged both transparency and the safety of survivors.
So, in this vacuum of clarity, the documents have become a political football. You see it happening everywhere. Both sides are using the files to attack their opponents. Republicans are pointing to Democrats named in the files to accuse them of hypocrisy. And Democrats, in turn, are highlighting Republicans to accuse them of selective outrage. It's become less about finding the truth and more about scoring political points.
And this really gets to the heart of the problem. When the goal is just to win an argument, accountability suffers. Real accountability has to be applied consistently, no matter what political party someone belongs to. Cherry-picking names to fit your narrative isn't a search for justice. It's just political warfare.
So, with all this complexity, how should you, process any new information that comes out about this? Let's build a simple framework based on the hard facts we've established.
Okay, let's just recap the hard facts. Fact 1. Yes, allegations involving powerful people are in these documents. That is true. Fact 2. An allegation is not proof. Fact 3, we know for sure that some of these specific claims were withdrawn or disputed. Fact 4, many names appear in contexts that have absolutely nothing to do with wrongdoing. And Fact 5, the DOJ's procedural failures just made a confusing situation even worse.
This is so fundamental. In our legal system, an allegation is where an investigation begins, not where it ends.
And context. It is not optional. Knowing if a claim comes from a formal deposition or a lawsuit that was later withdrawn isn't some minor detail. It changes everything. Context determines the meaning.
And finally, any conversation about this has to prioritize the privacy and the dignity of survivors. Releasing information in a way that re-traumatizes victims isn't transparency, it's a profound failure.
So we end on this question. When unproven allegations can be instantly turned into weapons, who is responsible for the truth? You know, in today's media landscape, that responsibility is more difficult and more important than ever. It doesn't just fall on officials and journalists. It falls on all of us.